Everyone is breathlessly reporting on President Trump's flurry of executive orders from his first day in office. Birthright citizenship, trans rights, TikTok, you name it. But few sources are digging into whether Trump can actually do any of the things that he's trying to do by executive order. So I guess we're gonna do it. Now, executive orders are official documents through which the President of the United States manages the operations of the federal government. The Constitution does not directly address executive orders, and no federal statute explicitly authorizes them. However, they are accepted as part of a president's inherent powers regarding the executive branch. A president can issue executive orders to direct the executive branch, enforce existing laws, or manage national emergencies, provided the president acts within their constitutional or statutory authority. Executive orders do not need congressional approval and cannot be directly overturned by lawmakers. But an executive order cannot contradict congressionally passed laws or contradict the Constitution. Executive orders have become more common over time, in part because congressional gridlock has made passing laws more difficult. Traditionally, the party that is not in the White House complains about the abuse of executive orders, and then once they get into the White House, they do even more via executive order than the previous administration. But actions taken pursuant to these orders are subject to judicial oversight, and you can bet that many of Trump's orders will be contested in court, just like they were during his first term. So let's dig into these executive orders. In one, Trump declared a national emergency on the US-Mexico border. In another order, Trump declared, quote, the current situation at the southern border qualifies as an invasion. The order suspends, quote, the physical entry of aliens involved in an invasion into the United States across the southern border until I determine that the invasion has concluded. Now, can the president do this? Well, the Immigration and Nationality Act outlines the legal framework for individuals who seek protection in the US because they fear persecution in their home country. And the president might not be permitted to suspend physical entry of asylum seekers into the United States, and he may not be authorized to stop asylum seekers who are already in the United States from getting a hearing. Section 212F of the INA allows the president to restrict or suspend entry of non-citizens or groups of non-citizens into the United States if their entry is determined to be detrimental to the interests of the United States. Trump has dubiously asserted that immigrants are passing through countries with communicable diseases, and that one reason they are detrimental is to the health and national security of Americans, but this determination might have exceeded his authority. To deal with this alleged invasion, Trump asked the Secretary of State to designate specific international groups, including Tren de Aragua and MS-13, as foreign terrorist organizations. It says, quote, within 14 days of the date of this order, the Secretary of State shall take all appropriate action in consultation with the Secretary of the Treasury, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of Homeland Security and the Director of National Intelligence to make a recommendation regarding the designation of any cartel. Can he do that? Probably. The authority to designate a group as a foreign terrorist organization is delegated to the Secretary of State by the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. So the president may direct the Secretary of State to review certain groups for potential designation, but the formal authority lies with the Secretary. Trump also announced plans to invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to take action against these groups, but that act only applies to people who are nationals of countries the US is at war with or where there is a declared hostility. Trump ordered the government to halt the admission of refugees and cites situations in places like Springfield, Ohio and Charleroi, Wisconsin, where large numbers of refugees settled. You might recall some of the complete fabricated lies about immigrants eating pets. Trump says his authority to suspend the US refugee admissions program stems from his Section 212F powers. But Trump ordered the Secretary of State and others to designate cartels and gangs as foreign terrorist organizations. And he ostensibly gave the military more power to, quote, protect the territorial integrity of the United States and seal the borders. Trump directed the Attorney General to seek the death penalty for capital crimes committed by immigrants without legal status. And in another order, Trump rescinded former President Biden's administrative executive orders and ordered the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security to, quote, evaluate and undertake any lawful actions to ensure that so-called sanctuary jurisdictions are ineffective. He also ordered the director of OMB to deny public benefits to illegal aliens who are not eligible for it. And the president is certainly within his authority to rescind former President Biden's orders and take lawful actions to limit the authority of sanctuary cities and states within the law. Trump also signed an order resuming building of the wall, suspending the CNHV parole program, which enabled Haitians, Venezuelans, Cubans, and Nicaraguans to settle temporarily in the United States. And the government must also stop allowing non-citizens in Mexico to make appointments to present asylum claims. Some of these new restrictions are probably within the president's powers, but it's hard to say how each of these will play out. The language in the executive order is not specific enough to tell us exactly what Trump will do and how he will do it, and it's likely that he will continue to sign new orders in this area, which will give us more clarity on what he can and cannot do. And the ACLU has already filed suit over the refugee policies. And as predicted, Trump has attacked birthright citizenship. As Liz Dye explained in our previous video, birthright citizenship is a cornerstone of constitutional law and has been reaffirmed in legal decisions for 150 years. Trump's order ostensibly declares that a child born in the United States is not a citizen if, at the time of birth, their mother is either unlawfully present in the United States or their mother's presence in the United States was lawful but temporary, and their father was not a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident. It applies to children born after 30 days from the date of the order, and the order is broader than expected, ostensibly covering children of undocumented immigrants and also those born to foreign nationals who are legally in the country on visas. Now, the interpretation of the 14th Amendment on which this executive order relies is not reflected in current law or legal precedent, and therefore it's very likely the courts will strike it down. As we've covered in other videos, the 14th Amendment says that birthright citizenship applies unless you are not bound by the laws of the United States. And I think even the Trump administration wants immigrants and tourists to be bound by the laws of the United States when they are in this country. Or he just created the purge. I don't know. Maybe that's what he wants too. Now, lawyers are not going to give up on bedrock constitutional rights without a fight, and the ACLU and at least 18 states have filed lawsuits to enjoin this order. Then there's TikTok. We've finally seen the TikTok order, and it raises more questions than answers. The order instructs the Attorney General not to take any action under the law for 75 days, and this extension is meant to give ByteDance, TikTok's Chinese parent company, additional time to negotiate a sale of its U.S. assets. The order directs the Department of Justice to promise app stores the government won't fine them if they offer TikTok to new users. Quote, during this period, the Department of Justice shall take no action to enforce the act or impose any penalties against any entity for any non-compliance with the act. But as we talked about last week, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the TikTok ban statute. And the act says that the president may extend the ban deadline by 90 days, but only if a sale is in progress. ByteDance has insisted it will not sell TikTok, and no sale is in progress. And an executive order does not suspend a statute that was passed by Congress. Republican Senators Tom Cotton and Pete Ricketts insisted, quote, there is no legal basis for any kind of extension of its effective date. And Senator Cotton said, quote, nothing in the order changes the legal scheme, and the companies, quote, face hundreds of billions of dollars of ruinous liability under the law. The AG may follow Trump's directive, but nothing in the order prevents future administrations from fining companies who violated the law. And of note, Apple has still not made the app available for download by new users. And when he signed the order, Trump made a lot of wild statements about TikTok, an app he once tried to ban. And as we discussed in the video about the situation, the US government has serious concerns about TikTok's data collection practices. But Trump said that now he's seen TikTok, it's not that big of a deal. Quote, because I got to use it, and remember, TikTok is largely about kids, young kids. If China is going to get information about young kids out of it, to be honest, I think we have bigger problems than that. So great, the president doesn't care about those data issues now that he's cozied up to the CEO of TikTok, and now he just won't enforce the law. Now, we've expressed some skepticism about the legal basis for the TikTok ban, but at the same time, the precedent of just not enforcing a law that the Supreme Court says is valid is also super, super bad. But elsewhere, Trump signed an executive order establishing the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, and appointing Elon Musk as its leader. The order does not create a new department. Instead, it rebrands the U.S. Digital Service as the United States DOGE Service. Now, I know we have bigger fish to fry, but this to me might be the most offensive thing that happened on a grammatical level, shoving an acronym inside of an acronym. So yeah, I guess we all have to live with the United States Department of Government Efficiency Service. Wonderful. The order directs each federal agency to establish a DOGE team comprising of at least 4 members, including a team leader, an engineer, a human resources specialist, and an attorney. These teams are required to implement DOGE's initiatives within their respective agencies. Now, to your burning question, does Trump have the authority to establish DOGE? Yeah, probably. Creating an entirely new federal department typically requires legislative action by Congress. However, the president can issue executive orders reorganizing or renaming existing agencies. In this instance, DOGE was formed by rebranding a pre-existing U.S. digital service. Though that might cause more problems than it solves, given that it completely changes the mission of the existing service. Now, obviously, if you're issuing hundreds of dubious executive orders, you'll want a good lawyer. But if you want a great lawyer, let my law firm, the Eagle Team, help. If you've gotten in a car crash, suffered a data breach, especially if you've got a data breach letter saying your information might have been leaked, or dealing with a workers' comp or social security issue, we can represent you or help find you the right attorney. Because it's so important to talk to a lawyer right away so we can maximize your recovery. And by the way, we don't get paid unless you do, so there's nothing up front. So just click on the link in the description or call the phone number on screen for a free consultation with my team. Because you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle Team. Then there's criminal law. Trump signed a new executive order pushing the Department of Justice to expand its use of the federal death penalty. Under Biden, there was a moratorium on the federal death penalty, and under the new order, the DOJ must seek death as a punishment in all applicable federal cases and to help states get sufficient supplies for lethal injection drugs for executions. Trump also directs the Attorney General to, quote, seek the overruling of Supreme Court precedents that limit the authority of state and federal governments to impose capital punishment. This order could be referring to a number of Supreme Court decisions which limited application of the death penalty. The court has prohibited the death penalty for crimes where the victim did not die, and eliminates the death penalty for juveniles and limits execution of offenders with disabilities. And in answer to your question, why yes, it does seem like an administration preparing to kill as many people as possible. Now, during Trump's first term, he ended a 17-year hiatus on the use of the federal death penalty, and Trump's administration carried out 13 executions during his last months in office. However, these requests generally fall within the president's power to influence how the DOJ allocates resources and develops legal strategies. President Trump also wants the AG to determine whether these offenders can be charged with state capital crimes, and it's fine for the president to order a book report about whether they can be tried again in state court, but that's as far as the order goes. The president can't direct state prosecutions to charge his offenders with state crimes simply because he thinks they should get the death penalty. Trump has also withdrawn the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accord and the World Health Organization. Although the agreement was signed by the United States, the Senate never ratified it as a treaty. This distinction allows the president to unilaterally withdraw the U.S. from the agreement without requiring congressional approval. America joined the WHO through a joint resolution passed by Congress in 1948, which included a stipulation for withdrawal upon providing 1 year's notice. In 2020, President Trump initiated a withdrawal from the WHO. President Biden halted that in 2021, and there's no legal problem with Trump withdrawing from the WHO as long as he follows the notice requirements. President Trump signed orders to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America and revert Alaska's Mount Denali to its former name, Mount McKinley. Can he do this? No and yes. The president's executive order directs federal agencies to use the new designation Gulf of America in official U.S. documents and communications. However, the change applies solely within the United States and does not have international jurisdiction. The International Hydrographic Organization, which standardizes maritime nomenclature worldwide, doesn't have to change the name. Therefore, the other nations can still call it the Gulf of Mexico. In the United States, the naming of geographical features is primarily managed by the Board on Geographic Names, the BGN, established to maintain uniformity in place names across federal agencies. And in 2015, President Obama's Secretary of the Interior, Sally Jewell, used her authority to change the name of Mount McKinley to Denali, which Native Alaskans have called it for thousands of years. So Trump can legally change that name. The president has the authority to order or suggest the secretary change the place names. In changing the name back, Trump followed the same procedure that Obama used to change the name to Denali. And Trump also signed an executive order standardizing national architecture styles. The order mandates that new federal buildings like courthouses and agency headquarters adhere to classical architectural styles such as Greek and Roman. Trump asserts that these styles are sturdy and useful. The order criticizes modernist styles, particularly brutalism and deconstructivism, as failing to embody American ideals. So I guess in terms of what's more important than your children's data being expatriated to China, President Trump meant defining what future buildings are going to look like on the outside. The order directs the GSA to update architectural guidelines within 90 days to prioritize classical styles. Now, near the end of Trump's first term, he issued an executive order establishing a new classification for federal civil servants known as Schedule F. Schedule F was never implemented, and President Biden repealed it shortly after taking office. President Trump has now reinstated the Schedule F classification. Now, generally, career civil servants are shielded from political interference so they can carry out their responsibilities without political pressure. But Trump's order says all federal employees are, quote, required to faithfully implement administration policies to the best of their ability, consistent with their constitutional oath, and the vesting of executive authority solely in the president. The National Treasury Employees Union filed a lawsuit which argues that the president does not have the authority to reclassify federal workers as at-will employees. And we'll certainly talk more about this as the case moves through the courts. If you want to get into the weeds on this, check out the video that we did on Project 2025. Oh, and by the way, all of this is basically straight out of Project 2025. But Trump also ordered federal employees to return to the office full-time and ordered a hiring freeze for all positions except for the military, immigration, and other law enforcement jobs. And these orders are probably within his powers as the leader of the executive branch. And turning now to Trump's new political staff, Trump signed a memorandum giving his new hires interim security clearances without background checks. This allows them to have temporary access to classified information. Can he do that? Yeah, probably, even to Tulsi Gabbard. The president possesses broad authority over the classification and declassification of information, as well as the granting of security clearances. The authority is derived from the president's constitutional role as commander-in-chief and has been affirmed through legal precedents. Trump signed executive orders aimed at dismantling federal diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. These orders directed federal agencies to terminate DEI-related initiatives within 60 days, place DEI staff on paid leave with plans for eventual layoffs, and review employment practices to ensure they exclude DEI considerations. Is this within the president's powers? Yeah, probably as the head of the executive branch, except to the extent that it's already codified in statute. The president has the authority to issue executive orders to manage federal operations. This includes directing how federal agencies implement policies and manage programs. President Biden issued orders to promote the ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion during his tenure, and Trump can revoke those. However, if these initiatives conflict with federal civil rights laws like Title VII, then it would be problematic. For example, in his executive order ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity, the Trump administration rescinds Executive Order 11246, which President Lyndon Johnson signed in 1965. This order desegregated federal contracting. And President Trump also signed several executive orders impacting transgender rights. The first order mandates that all federal agencies recognize only two immutable genders, male and female, on official documents, including U.S. passports. The order conflicts with the American Medical Association's guidance, which states that gender identity exists on a spectrum rather than as an immutable male-female binary. Stephen Miller, the architect of Trump's 2017 Muslim ban, seems to have written the order. He tried to define the words male and female. Female means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the large reproductive cell. Quote, male means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the small reproductive cell. Some have suggested that Miller used AI to draft part of this order because it's so friggin' dumb, and maybe that's why the order uses strange phrasing. We're assuming here that large reproductive cell is an egg or an ovum, and the small reproductive cell is the sperm. But these definitions assume that from the moment of conception, humans are male or female. But as every doctor knows, at conception, humans do not yet produce gametes, which are what determines the sex characteristics. So congratulations, everyone. There's only two genders, and everyone is neuter, neither of the two genders. And in some ways, it is morbidly hilarious that, given the task of determining what is a woman, the Trump administration has no friggin' clue. But President Trump's order prevents people from changing the sex designation on U.S. passports. The order does not impact state laws, and the president cannot unilaterally change state laws that allow transgender people to update their names and gender markers on their driver's licenses. But generally, can he do the rest of this? Probably. Under Federal Law 22 U.S.C. 211A, it grants the Secretary of State the authority to issue passports under rules prescribed by the president or secretary. However, these orders must not conflict with existing laws for constitutional rights, and people will challenge this order in court. And of course, this is an area of the law that is rapidly changing. In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled in Bostick versus Clayton County that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on sex, also prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. At least at the moment, this decision would trump the president's new executive orders. However, Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh have already said they'd like to overrule Bostock. Trump also revoked Biden's order allowing transgender people to serve openly in the military. And can he reinstate that ban? Well, maybe. The Supreme Court allowed Trump's ban to take effect in 2019, but they did not issue an opinion on the merits. Can the president ban medical treatments and procedures? Probably not. The president doesn't have the direct authority to compel a state to alter its healthcare practices. However, he can incentivize policy changes by attaching conditions to federal funding. Later this year, the Supreme Court will decide whether states can ban gender treatment for minors. President Trump also signed an order requiring the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence to investigate potential free speech infringements that may have occurred during the Biden administration. This order covers actions the Biden administration took in several areas, including the January 6th prosecutions, FBI investigations into threats against teachers, and collaboration with social media companies. Upon completing these inquiries, the Attorney General and Director of National Intelligence will make recommendations for future action. This order probably falls within the president's powers, but we don't know if it will end up being a nothing burger or a pretext to purge disloyal employees. The nominees for Attorney General and D&I, Pam Bondi and Tulsi Gabbard, could use it to create a list of employees who should be fired, going above and beyond Schedule F. Then there is the environment. In Trump's inauguration speech, he said, quote, "We will drill, baby, drill," and he then issued a flurry of orders that were gifts to fossil fuel companies. The first was a declaration of national energy emergency. Quote, "The United States' insufficient energy production, transportation, refining, and generation constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to our nation's economy, national security, and foreign policy." The order defines the term energy or energy resources as crude oil, natural gas, least condensates, natural gas liquids, refined petroleum products, uranium, coal, biofuels, geothermal heat, the kinetic movement of flowing water, and critical minerals. And this definition somehow leaves out the fastest growing sector of energy resources, the renewable energy sources like wind and solar. Trump used the national emergency declaration to take additional actions, like he instructed the Energy Secretary to resume reviewing applications for liquefied natural gas export projects. He rescinded a 2021 Biden executive order that aimed for 50% of U.S. vehicle sales to be electric by 2030, and he outlawed offshore windmills. Does Trump have the authority to invoke a national energy emergency? Probably, because the president's ability to declare an emergency is very broad. Congress granted the president access to 137 statutory powers upon declaring a national emergency, And these powers encompass actions such as seizing property, organizing and controlling the means of production, and deploying military forces domestically. During his first term, Trump invoked a national emergency at the border and used it to justify building the wall. Many commentators have pointed out that the president's powers in this area are potentially so vast that they could easily be exploited by a power-hungry president. Boy, that would be really terrible, wouldn't it? Now, the eyes of the world are fixed on what Donald Trump is going to do next. He broke the record for signing the most day one executive orders in US history, which in turn compelled most news outlets to write headlines that speak to the set of executive orders as a whole rather than any one in particular. Yes, this is going to be the Mr. Burns effect presidency. So it's not surprising that Trump's first day in office was covered by a whopping 414 sources, spread out evenly over left, center, and right sources. And when we compare the headlines, we start to see some interesting patterns emerge. On the left, a common theme of the headlines is the use of words like avalanche, spate, or that the circus is back in town. These all suggest a process that was chaotic, rushed, and not well thought out. On the right, a common phrase is the headline taking the reins back, implying the opposite, that these executive orders were an end to the chaos and start of an optimistic future. And center sources typically ran headlines absent of loaded language, but that downplay what actually happened, like President Donald Trump issues series of executive actions on day one. But the headlines you read have immense power to shape how you understand the news. And that's why I like to see news from as many angles as possible, and I can with the help of today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. And right now they're offering LegalEagle viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage subscription. You can scan the QR code or use the link in the description to get the discount for a limited time. Because Ground News gathers related articles from around the world and across the political spectrum, so you can see the bias and compare coverage. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For any story, you can not only see the coverage details and political bias, but you can also see the factuality and ownership information the source is reporting. And one of my favorite features is their bias comparison feature, which highlights specific differences in reporting across the political spectrum. This can be especially helpful when reading stories from sources you've never heard of, when there's no telling who owns it or what their agenda might be. It also helps explain why we often talk past each other, and some people seem hyper-focused on what seems like nonsense, often because some random blog post went viral among certain people. And that's why Ground News is my favorite way to get the news. And as a Legal Eaglet, you can save 40% off the Ground News Vantage subscription by scanning the code on screen or clicking on the link down below. This subscription gives you unlimited access to every feature, including the Bias Insight tool and Blind Spot feed. And by subscribing, you'll support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. So click on the link below to get 40% off. And after that, click on this link over here for more Legal Eagle, or I'll see you in court.